Hello. You should get through what I'm about to tell you without too much trouble this morning. First, you're back from vacation, well rested, having had proper nights of sleep. Second, you know the definition of youth. You're young as long as you feel immortal and invincible. And when you're immortal and invincible, no problem can scare you, nothing to fear. Who here has never heard of the energy transition? Everyone has heard of the energy transition. Now, if I told you there's no lecture today, just a pop quiz, and I asked you to define energy, who could answer? 3 brave or reckless souls. What I want to show you this morning is that transitioning on something you can't define is a bit problematic. I'll try to explain what we're really talking about when we discuss the problem at hand. I won't focus much on solutions. That'll keep you busy for the rest of your lives anyway, so you'll have plenty of work ahead. Instead, I'll give you a framework for understanding the problem. You'll see it's far more complex than what you might gather from the news. You'll work longer than your elders did. Sorry, I don't mean to be unpleasant. First, we'll extend the retirement age. I bet this man here is already retired. Let's dive right into the heart of the matter. When we talk about energy, what are we really talking about? What exactly is energy? If I ask not who can define energy, but what do you think energy is? I'm asking the French public as a whole. When I mention energy, the first thing people think of isn't physics at all. It's money. People think about money. So they'll immediately answer, energy is something you buy. It's a bill. Energy means an electricity bill, a gas bill. Some might mention their fuel costs, especially the yellow vest protesters, but ultimately, energy equals a bill in people's minds. So energy is about whether it's expensive or cheap. And it seems disconnected from how society evolves, handed off to a few engineers. If wind is cheaper than nuclear, go with wind. Problem solved. But you'll see this is the wrong answer, or at least a wrong answer. The reason is simple. Look at what energy really costs you. Let me ask, who here pays an electricity or gas bill directly? Directly, yourself. Of those who raise their hands, who can instantly tell me the amount of their last bill, about 15% of you from those who raised their hands before. Now, who here rents an apartment, and who can tell me the exact amount of their last rent? Same people, right? What I've just shown you is that energy bills are small enough that they don't register in your mind as a significant expense. And indeed, it is a small bill. When you look at energy spending, whether for households or the whole economy, depending on who's buying and what type of energy, it's just a few percent of total spending. Put another way, energy companies' revenue in global GDP is just a few percent. The value of oil traded annually, for example, is 3% of global GDP. So if energy represents a few percent of bills, just a few percent of spending, then Homo economicus rationally thinks, if it's a few percent of my expenses, I'll spend a few percent of my time on it, case closed, and focus on more important things. That's exactly how nearly all decision makers think, minus under 0,432,000 plurals, 0,434,000 of economic decision makers, politicians, and senior officials think. It's a bill, a few percent of our spending, so we'll spend a few percent of our time on it, and so on. Unfortunately, this reasoning is about as sound as saying your brain is 2% of your body weight. And by the way, in men, testosterone is far less than 2% of body weight, so you can deal with it 2% of the time and ignore it the rest of the time. Obviously, if I remove half your brain, you'll have some serious problems in life. And if in men I remove all the testosterone, or in women all the estrogen, I'll significantly change what happens to you. Even though I've touched something representing a tiny fraction of your mass, so what energy represents as a share of our spending isn't the point, because you'll realize that everything in the modern world depends on it. These economic arguments using pie charts hide the dependencies between one slice and another. There's another common fallacy often cited. Agriculture is 2% of GDP, so if we skip it, no big deal, except that if you stop eating, the remaining 98% of GDP becomes irrelevant too. So with pie chart reasoning, be very, very careful. There's an extremely common illusion in this type of reasoning, which is that it doesn't show you the dependencies between one slice of the pie and another. Never, ever, ever base future projections on pie chart slices without verifying that the slices are independent of each other. So energy is a few percent of what we spend, meaning it's not a big deal as an expense. Now, the second answer you might hear these days is that we must save energy. People will tell you that the best energy is the energy you don't use. Well, wrong. If you're in this room today, instead of picking potatoes, it's precisely because we didn't save energy for the past 2 centuries. I'll explain that shortly. The third thing you sometimes hear about energy is that it must be 100% renewable. Well, I'll show you shortly. That 100% renewable is the world we're leaving behind. 3 centuries ago, the world was 100% renewable. 3 centuries ago, we only used renewable energy, nothing else. We only used animal power, biomass, wind power, windmills, and water mills, and so on. That's all we used. And in fact, for 3 centuries, we've spent our time switching from renewables to fossil fuels. We had a 100% renewable navy, but we thought, no, to quickly bring clothes from Zara to French stores, that's not good enough. A fossil-powered fleet works much better, and we had 100% renewable transportation, but we thought, no, to quickly bring peaches from the southwest to Paris, fossil-powered transport works much better, it's far more efficient. We had 100% renewable agriculture, people ate potatoes and onions and had bad breath. But we thought, no, to eat steak at every meal, fossil-powered agriculture is much better, it's far more efficient. We had 100% renewable public works. The Suez Canal and Roman roads were built with shovels and pickaxes, but we thought, no, to quickly build roundabouts, very important, roundabouts in this country, fossil-powered public works is far more efficient. So that's what we switched to. We had 100% renewable construction, a century to build Notre Dame, version 1. Version 2 will be faster anyway, but today it takes just a year to build a tower in La Défense. So fossil-powered construction is far more efficient, or at least mostly fossil-powered. We had 100% renewable industry based on mills, but we thought, no, to make the latest smartphone at 20 euros a month, fossil-powered industry is far more efficient. 201 boel x1 vurzul 8, dul x1 zurzul 8, boel x1 zurzul 8 mil 8. It's far more efficient to have a 100% fossil fuel-based industry. We even had 100% renewable alfalfa dryers called the sun, and today we have gas-powered alfalfa dryers because it's far more efficient. So for 2 centuries now, we've been spending our time switching from renewable to fossil energy. So one of 2 things, either we're certified idiots, which is possible after all, some philosophers have said as much, or there's a fundamental physical reason why we've been doing this for 2 centuries. And that's what I'll try to explain from here on. There's a deep physical reason for this. And so it won't be a piece of cake at all, as the English say, to go 100% renewable while preserving today's purchasing power and the long studies that allow you to be here. My bet is that it's simply not possible, but I'll try to demonstrate that later. So we have 3 wrong answers. Energy isn't just a bill. We haven't been conserving it until now, as we'll see. And in fact, we've spent our time leaving the 100% renewable world behind the real answer about energy, as you'll see now. Is that energy is what allowed us to become Superman for real. You know, Superman or Superwoman doesn't matter. They fly, we fly too, we have planes. Superman has monstrous physical strength. He can stop anything he wants. Well, energy is what lets you build machines that can stop anything. The machine just needs to be big enough. Superman can see very far. Well, thanks to energy, we build devices, we create visual prosthetics that let us see incredibly far. They're called satellites, telescopes, and so on. So energy is really what allowed us to become Superman for real. That's what I'm going to explain from this point on. And that's precisely why this addiction is so sweet and why it's so hard to give up. Now, for this, I need to return to some physics. Oh, the horror, who studied physics in their younger years before coming here? Ah, excellent. So everyone who studied physics should normally be able to define what energy is. They didn't raise their hands earlier, so either they weren't paying attention. So let me give you, actually physicists still debate how to summarize what energy is in a single sentence, but I'll give you my version. We pretty much all agree on this. In physics, energy by definition is what quantifies the transformation of the environment. Let me put it even more precisely. Energy quantifies the change of state of a system. That's energy in physics. So whenever you have a system that changes state, changes temperature, changes speed, changes shape, changes anything at all, really anything, energy is involved. So counting energy means counting the physical transformation of the world around us. That's what energy is. So it's a physical quantity before it becomes a subject of political debate. Now, physical quantities have an annoying habit. They're governed by laws that don't depend on us. So if you want, because it's in some political platform, 301, 010, 53,000 plurs, 0010, 54,000, okay. So if you want, since it's in a political platform, to change the law of energy conservation through a vote in Parliament because you think it would look good in a political platform, go ahead and try. I'll bet all my savings against anyone that you won't succeed. Okay, because energy, once again, is a physical quantity governed by laws that are beyond our control. It's quite frustrating to have things beyond our control. We've become accustomed after this century of technological progress and widespread energy use to thinking we can solve anything and overcome any obstacle. Not quite. There's a fundamental law in physics that governs energy called the conservation law. The name says it all. The conservation law states something very simple. It says that in a closed system with no external exchange, the amount of energy remains absolutely constant. Over time, it's not like I'll give you 10% more or less if I'm a good negotiator. No, it's absolutely constant. That's a pretty strict law, absolutely constant. So applied to humans, this means that we have no choice when it comes to energy, but to extract from our environment energy that's already there and use it for our benefit. Now, using energy means, in practice, putting it through a converter. In other words, you feed energy into a physical system that produces something else. Historically, the only physical system that humans use, or rather the first physical system to be more precise that humans used, was themselves. We are our own first energy converter, and the energy we put into it is called eating yum yum 3 times a day, at least in countries where people have enough food. So the first converter used by humans was their own body, powered by an energy source called food, and from it we produce 2 things. Heat, lots of it, because we are warm-blooded animals, some movement and the ability to say a few interesting things or less interesting ones into a microphone. That's movement 2. And then over time, we realized we could harness other energy sources available in our environment to our advantage. And those were precisely renewable energies, wood, wind, water power, and so on, which we entrusted to other converters. Some were biological, for example, biomass, 4-1, 1258 folion, 1259 Salion. We can entrust it to a biological converter called a draft animal. And at that point, we already multiply our muscle strength for the first time. But we can also entrust it to an inert converter, for example, a mill, and that too will multiply our muscle strength. And so we use pretty much all available renewable energies to increase our capacity to transform the environment. Then one day, brilliant engineers arrived and said, I have something much better, sir. I have something called the engine. So the engine is another converter, also completely inert, made of metal and capable of consuming an energy source that you cannot consume because you do not eat oil. Well, you do not drink oil. It is not great. I would not recommend it. But these converters can harness energy sources that we cannot use, oil, gas, coal, even uranium, and produce transformations of the environment on an absolutely massive scale compared to what our muscles can achieve. And so we have grown and multiplied, which means that from now on, whenever you see the word energy somewhere in a newspaper article, a speech, etc., cross out energy and replace it with machines. In other words, using more and more energy means using more and more machines. Now, the energy you use, you see only a small part of it directly. The vast majority you do not see. No one came into this room naked. That is forbidden in France, by the way. So to avoid being naked, you got dressed this morning. Well, by getting dressed, you use thousands of machines without even realizing it. Those wearing natural fibers, cotton, linen, and so on, 501, 014, 38,000, plowers, 014, 39,000, thousands of machines without even realizing it. All those wearing natural fibers, cotton, linen, and so on, unknowingly used tractors, combine harvesters, machines that stored it in silos, trucks that transported it to spinning mills, chemical factories that dyed it, and so on. You didn't even realize it, but you used all of this for your benefit. If you're wearing synthetic fibers, all those fancy poly whatevers, you've used petroleum derivatives. So without knowing it, you've used an oil platform, a refinery, a steam cracker, and so on. And all of this you did even if you're half asleep in the morning. You don't take 15 minutes to dress unless you're standing in front of your wardrobe hesitating. So it happens very, very fast. In just 1 minute, you've exploited thousands of machines for your benefit. I could describe every daily activity you perform until you entered. This room, each one exploits thousands, tens of thousands of machines for your benefit. But you don't realize it. And the energy you use is essentially there to show how overpowered these machines are compared to our bodies. I'll do a little exercise. It's the start of the school year, so some of you may have gone hiking in the mountains. Who went hiking this summer? So a few of you worked up a sweat. The point of mountain hiking is to climb, otherwise it's just a bushwalk. So you leave early, and let's say you climb 2,000 meters of elevation in a day. Who has climbed 2,000 meters of elevation in one day this summer? Fewer hands now, right? 601, 16, 18,000. Blorzel is 16, 19,000. Oh, bravo. Well, if you climb 2,000 meters in elevation, for those who can't get to the mountains, there's an alternative. You can climb the Eiffel Tower 6.3 times. That works just as well on foot, mind you, not in the elevator with the Japanese tourist. No, on foot, that's also 2,000 meters of elevation gain. By making this effort and holding your body up 2,000 meters of elevation, the amount of energy your legs provide, since people who walk on their hands are rare in this kind of exercise, will be a measly ½ kilowatt-hour. So you sweat all day long, and you do sweat quite a bit. When climbing 2,000 meters, you sweat all day. You're grateful for the meal you eat that evening, yet ½ kilowatt-hour of mechanical energy is all your legs could provide. For an effort of this kind, if you do this, 50 tons of dirt in a day, not bad, 50 tons of dirt in a day, that's about 6 cubic meters, a big hole, a big planting bed, where you produce 10 times less energy than the person climbing a mountain, since it's only 0.05 kilowatt hours that you'll have produced during the day with your arms, some from your back, and with plenty of blisters. So if you do this every other day, same thing, by year's end, you'll have produced 10 kilowatt hours, 7,017, 59,000 plurals, 018, 18, 59, 59, 018, 18, 15 hours of mechanical energy. So remember, a manual laborer working hard can provide 10 to 100 kilowatt hours of mechanical energy per year. That's the annual output per year. And remember, energy is the capacity to transform the environment. Now, if you take a liter of gasoline, which, as you know from recent news, costs the scandalously high price of 1.50 euros, outrageously expensive and so on, etc. Well, in a liter of gasoline, you have 10 kilowatt hours of thermal energy. Run that through an engine, you get 2 to 4 kilowatt hours of mechanical energy. In other words, in 1 liter of gasoline, costing the scandalously high price of 1.50 euros, you have the same capacity to transform the environment in 1 liter. I stress this, as in 10 to 100 days of hard labor by a human being, 1 liter. And the French consume hundreds of liters per year each. Now let's talk money, since after all, that's all we really care about. Well, 1 kilowatt hour of mechanical energy from a man at work or a woman at work costs me, in the West, paid at minimum wage, a few hundred to a few thousand euros per kilowatt hour. Whereas the machine provides the same service for a marginal cost of a few tens of cents, let me put it another way, when we switched from human labor to machines, we managed to divide in a century and a half the unit cost of transforming the environment by a few hundred to a few thousand. The purchasing power promised by politicians comes from there. It doesn't come from the fact that they're smarter than average, which they are not, by the way, but rather from physics allowing us to harness energy converters for our benefit, which have multiplied our capacity to transform the environment by unimaginable factors that nobody is aware of, and which, as I'll show you shortly, the economy doesn't reflect at all. 8001 does 1943,000, does 1944,000 to transform the environment by unimaginable factors that nobody is aware of, and which, as I'll show you shortly, the economy doesn't reflect at all. Let's imagine I take a slave now. This stays between us because it's forbidden by law, and people who enjoy that are rare. So if you take a slave, generally speaking, it's someone for whom it's not a career. It's not you realize that even a slave will cost you 10 to 100 times more than a machine that isn't unionized, doesn't go on strike, and works around the clock. So the reason slavery disappeared in the West, in my view, is simply not because our genetic code makes us good people while 2 centuries ago we were evil. We have exactly the same genetic code. Apologies to Laurent Alexandre. No, it's simply because right now there's absolutely no economic rationale for bothering to enslave your fellow humans because it's a hassle, while the machine does it for much less money without offending anyone's morality. So it's oil that saved the slaves, not our genetic code that changed. Here are some initial points on why we started consuming energy in large amounts. So now if I look at the machines that use energy, 911 035 wordt gefassen 920 blur, 035 wordt out 920 about not trusting the press. Never trust the press, never, I insist, never. It's never reliable evidence. Meanwhile, the human population has grown just a little bit. Actually, it's not meanwhile, it's thanks to energy that the human population grew. Because in fact, if crops don't grow here, we transport them from where they do. Energy lets us preserve food. Energy lets us protect ourselves from heat and cold. Energy gives us free time to research medicines. Because when you're busy growing potatoes, there aren't many medical researchers working on extending your life. Energy protects you from microbes when you're born and so on. So the increase in life expectancy is a direct consequence of increased energy use. It's a direct consequence. So at the same time that we use more energy per person, transforming the environment more per person, we are also becoming more numerous. So why did humans settle down 10,000 years ago? Do you know why humans became sedentary 10,000 years ago? Because 10,000 years ago we emerged from the last major climate transition humanity experienced, namely the deglaciation, and the climate became stable. The climate was stable for 10,000 years until we started messing with it. A stable climate allows you to develop practices that are reproducible from one year to the next, whereas with an unstable climate, you can't stay in one place. We are the distant descendants of this climate stabilization. Today, you live in cities, well, you study in cities. Agriculture came first, then cities, because without agriculture, there are no cities. This is a consequence of climate stabilization. So 10,000 years ago, the climate stabilized, and back then, even though census data wasn't great, there were a few million of us on Earth. By the start of the Industrial Revolution, we'd gained a factor of 100, roughly a factor of several dozen, reaching about 1 billion. Then in just 2 centuries, boom, we hit 7 billion, and it keeps growing. When I was born, the human population was half what it is today. Sure, I'm an old geezer to you, but that's still a massive increase within one lifetime. So the question is, seeing this trajectory, do we think the population will stay stable at 7, 8 billion? I'm not convinced at all. In fact, I'm fairly convinced of the opposite. Among the adjustments to expect in coming decades or centuries, there will be a population contraction that will happen in ways I can't predict, but I'm pretty sure it will happen. Now, when I combine energy per person times population change, this is what total energy use looks like, meaning the fleet of machines we power on Earth. See that little thing at the top that excites everyone? Meanwhile, the bulk of this energy powering most of the world's machines is carbon fossil fuels, even looking at recent trends, because you'll say, but until now, we weren't doing the transition. Now we've started. So things are better. Here's how global energy use has changed since 2000. Since 2000 isn't that long ago. You were probably born by then. Well, maybe barely, but still. So since roughly when you were born, here's how global energy use has changed. For each energy source, this chart doesn't show current usage, but the increase or decrease between 2000 and 2018. What increased the most between 2000 and 2018 by far isn't renewables, it's fossil fuels. Over this period, coal grew 5-10 times more than the two renewables. Everyone loves to discuss wind and solar. Though, by the way, hydropower is the leading renewable globally and grew more than wind and solar combined. But the differential still favors fossil fuels. Let me put it another way. I didn't invent this, but I find it amusing. If you drink a bottle of whiskey per week and your doctor says, slow down, you reply, no problem, I'll switch to 1.2 bottles of whiskey, but add a glass of orange juice. Do you think your liver's condition improves? That's exactly what we've done for 18 years, gone from 1 bottle to 1.5 bottles of whiskey while adding some orange juice and vitamin C on top. That's what we've done for 18 years. We're not solving our problem at all. Not at all, at all, at all, not at all. We're making our problem worse while adding a dash of something that says everything's fine. I mentioned electricity earlier. Part of the energy we use first passes through a power plant. A power plant is a converter, like other machines, taking available energy, oil, gas, coal, uranium, falling water, etc., and outputting another form of energy called electricity. Most power plants worldwide are thermal machines, meaning they first generate heat, then use that heat to make steam, spin a turbine, an alternator, and produce electricity. This heat can come from coal, minus 40% of global electricity, producing 1 kilogram CO2 per kilowatt hour. It can come from gas, minus 25% of global electricity, or oil, which is a few percent of global electricity. Then there's another thermal mode, nuclear, producing roughly 10 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. The first renewable non-thermal mode, meaning no heat needed for electricity, is hydropower, where water movement directly drives the turbine, but all other modes are thermal, which means all thermal modes are Carnot machines requiring cold sinks. So all riverside thermal plants have those big cooling towers, which in France symbolize nuclear plants, but coastal plants don't have them. Go to Penly, no cooling tower for that nuclear plant. However, a German riverside coal plant does have that big cooling tower. So these cooling towers aren't symbols of nuclear plants, they're symbols of riverside thermal plants. Another thing the press gets wrong, making a poor association, the correct association is cooling tower equals thermal plant, not cooling tower equals nuclear plant. Why is nuclear low carbon? Because there's a 1 to 1 million ratio between energy from combustion and energy from fission for the same amount of starting material. Put simply, fissioning 1 gram of uranium equals burning 1 ton of oil. So nuclear handles tiny amounts of material, even with diesel mining equipment, enrichment, the whole fuel chain and waste processing. Since it handles such small quantities per kilowatt hour produced, it emits very little CO2. It's not because you're being lied to, it's just physics. Hydropower also emits little CO2 because once you've built the dam, which uses concrete, emitting CO2 minus half that there's no more. And the new renewables, you see their share at the top, they're not zero carbon either. Making a solar panel requires 20 different metals that must be smelted. Smelting metals emit CO2 minus metallurgy, silicon metallurgy, copper metallurgy, etc. All of that emits CO2, so you have more or less depending on which collector you use. Using solar panels with battery storage can reach nearly 200 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. It ranges from 50 to 200. For reference, gas electricity is 400 grams per kilowatt hour. So it's not green at all. It's less carbon intensive than gas. That's a precise statement. Green isn't precise. Besides, electricity isn't green. Stick your fingers in a socket and you won't turn green. Electricity is electricity. You won't transform into the Hulk by sticking your fingers in a socket. It doesn't work that way. So what you see about electricity production, most is fossil, and most of the growth, and here I'm just showing the last 8 years, is also fossil. 1001, 2023, val 5000, 23, 123, val 6000. That's how today we build those magical roundabouts in just a few months or a few weeks, or sometimes even in just a few days. Whereas before, it took years of labor with shovels and pickaxes to achieve the same result. A truck produces the same power as 4,000 times the driver's legs. An airplane, and that's why pilots are paid more than truck drivers, produces the same power as 1,000,000 times the pilot's legs. And by the way, a large commercial jet has the same power as a large rolling mill that is operated as we speak by just one person. For those of you who have visited the rolling mill at Fos-sur-Mer, I don't know if anyone here has done so. It's a facility I once visited. At any given moment, there's one person in the control room who commands 100 million watts of power. Remember, a human's power output is about 100 watts, so someone with joysticks has multiplied their muscle power by 1,000,000. If I shut down the Fos-sur-Mer rolling mill and instead use people hitting metal sheets with hammers to get the same output, I'd need the entire Paris region, including you and me. We'd all get hammers and pound metal sheets all day long. Doing nothing else just to replace one rolling mill operated as we speak by a single person. So that's what energy is for. It's used to power these monsters made of metal, plastic, and stone that have turned us into real-life superheroes. They've made us into Superman or Iron Man, whichever you prefer, for real. So this energy that we use to power our converters, here's how it has evolved per person over the past century and a half. A century and a half ago, most of the energy we used was wood, meaning biomass derivatives. It was mainly used to produce heat for heating and cooking. 130, 25, Blizzarded 24, 1,000 per person for a century and a half. A century and a half, most of the energy we used was wood, meaning biomass derivatives. It was mainly used to produce heat for heating and cooking. 130, 25, 030, 24, when CERSO increasing deforestation until 1850, and it was called that saved French forests. Because we stopped using wood for forging, we also used wood to power the first steam engines of that era. So what you see is that wood use per person has declined steadily for a century and a half. But since there are many more people now, as we'll see later in absolute terms, it hasn't changed the same way. And you notice that all other energies we've used after wood are all either growing or stable, and they stack up on top of each other, meaning that to this day, there has been no large-scale energy substitution globally. We simply add one on top of another. So after wood, we began using coal, and you can see that coal consumption per person has never declined worldwide since we started using it. There has never been a drop in the amount of coal consumed globally. One reason for this is that coal today is the primary source of electricity generation in the world, meaning that the main method of producing electricity worldwide is 26 3,000 Bah Muscle power to machine power, each person on Earth, thanks to the machines they command through this energy, has multiplied their productive capacity by 200. So the energy that powers these machines has multiplied each person's ability to transform their environment by a factor of 200. Put another way, there are just over 7 billion of us on Earth. Without machines and energy, to achieve the same annual output, we would need 1.4 trillion people. That would create a slight food problem. So machines have genuinely turned us into superhumans, I insist. In the West, the multiplier isn't 200 minus, it's between 500 and 1,000. And for upper middle class professionals like most of you, it's between 1,000 and 2,000. So you in this room, and I include myself since I belong to the same category, live exactly as if we had 1,000 to 2,000 servants at our disposal around the clock. A French minimum wage worker, thanks to energy, lives like royalty today. That's the political tragedy of this situation. You can't tell them that, but it's the reality. That's the political tragedy of this situation. And even the French minimum wage worker's lifestyle, as we'll see shortly, is not sustainable. In other words, it's already too high compared to what nature can provide us. In terms of fuel and CO2 absorption capacity and so on, that once again is the political tragedy of this situation. So here's a small sample of your modern day servants. And what's more, these modern day servants have the great advantage over ancient servants, which were draft animals and human laborers, of feeding from underground resources. Draft animals competed with us for food. They needed land to feed themselves. That was land we couldn't use to feed people. Human servants also needed land to feed them. So that was land you couldn't use to feed the so-called free people, modern servants. However, feed from underground resources. So they leave us all the surface land. And incidentally, we also eat from underground resources. So one of the problems with renewable energy is that it revives competition for land use because renewable energy doesn't use underground resources, it uses surface land. So we return to this age-old problem of competing for land use with renewable energy. And so individually, it has multiplied our muscle power by a factor of 100 to 600. Who here has never heard that France is a nuclear country? So you read the same things I do, you read the same newspapers as I do. Well, here is the energy that powers the machines we use in France. Where do we use machines in this country? We use machines in our homes. That's the residential column. We use machines where we work. That's the tertiary sector. We use machines to manufacture goods. That's industry. We use machines to grow food. That's agriculture. And we use machines for moving things around. That's transportation. The vertical axis is measured in billions of kilowatt hours, what we call terawatt hours. And since 1 kilowatt hour equals 3.6 million joules, I can use kilowatt hours for everything, not just electricity. I can use them for coal, oil, gas, for any energy source. Wherever there's energy, I can express it in kilowatt hours. Now I'll circle what comes from fossil fuels for the machines we operate in this country. And now let me ask you, do you think France is a nuclear country? No? Who thinks that's an accurate statement, looking at this graph? This is a very practical illustration of what I just told you about not trusting the press ever. I insist, never. It's never reliable as a source. Meanwhile, the human population has grown somewhat. But it's not just coincidence. It's thanks to energy that the human population has grown, because energy has enabled us, for example, to virtually eliminate famines. If food doesn't grow here, we transport it from where it does. Energy allows us to preserve food. Energy allows us to protect ourselves from heat and cold. Energy gives us the free time to research medicine, 1601, 036, 26,000, plus 036, 28, 28. Because when everyone is busy growing potatoes, there aren't many medical researchers working on extending your life expectancy. Energy allows you to protect yourself from microbes at birth and so on. So in fact, the increase in life expectancy is a direct consequence of the rise in energy supply. It's a direct consequence. So while we use more and more energy per person, meaning we transform the environment more per person, we're also becoming more numerous. INSEE wasn't very efficient back then, but let's say when humans settled down 10,000 years ago. Do you know why humans settled down 10,000 years ago? Because 10,000 years ago, we had just emerged from the last major climate transition that humanity experienced, namely the deglaciation. And the climate became stable. The climate was stable for 10,000 years until we started messing with it. A stable climate allows us to develop practices that are reproducible from year to year, whereas with an unstable climate, you can't do that while staying in one place. We are the distant heirs of this climate stabilization. Since today you live in a city while you study in a city, the creation of agriculture and then cities, because without agriculture there are no cities, is a consequence of climate stabilization. So 10,000 years ago, the climate began to stabilize. And at the time, even though INSEE wasn't very efficient, there were only a few million people on Earth. By the start of the Industrial Revolution, we had already gained a factor of 100 in order of magnitude. Well, a factor of a few dozen, reaching about 1 billion. And then you see that in 2 centuries, boom, we jumped to 7 billion, and it keeps increasing. When I was born, the human population was half of what it is today. Sure, I'm an old geezer in your eyes, but still, that's a huge increase within a single lifetime. So the question is, when we see this kind of evolution, do we really think the population will stay stable at 7 or 8 billion indefinitely? I'm not entirely convinced, and in fact, I'm reasonably convinced of the opposite. So among the adjustments we should expect in the coming decades or centuries, there will be a contraction of the population that will happen in a way I can't predict, but I'm fairly certain it will occur. So now, once I combine energy per person multiplied by population change, this is what total energy consumption looks like, meaning the fleet of machines we're operating on Earth. And you see up there the little thing that excites everyone, while the bulk of the energy powering the world's machine fleet is carbon, that is fossil fuels. Even if I look at recent changes, because you'll tell me, yes, but until now we weren't focused on the transition, now we started the transition, so now it's getting better. This is how global energy consumption has changed since 2000. Since 2000, it wasn't that long ago, you were probably born around then. Well, maybe not many of you, but still. So you can see since roughly your birth how global energy consumption has evolved for each type of energy used on Earth. This chart doesn't show current consumption, but rather the increase or decrease between 2000 and 2018. Between 2000 and 2018. You can see that what increased the most between 2000 and 2018 by far is not renewable energy at all. It's fossil fuels. During this period, 1701, well 42, 23,040 lowers, well 142, 25040 today in economic research. Macroeconomic research, the only question researchers ask is how to bring back growth. I think it would be worthwhile if with 5% of our taxes, since research is essentially funded by our taxes, a small group of people would ask themselves, suppose growth doesn't return, what's the best way to optimize the system? So that's part of the answer to your question. Essentially, we flip the question around. We say, let's accept we won't have growth, not even that we're pursuing it and won't get it. What's the best way to organize ourselves so people can be as happy as possible? This is what engineers call constrained optimization. You impose a constraint. And yes, I think we need to, the problem is when you've been told your whole life that the faster you run, the better off you are, it's unspeakable to tell you that now we're going to explain that the slower you run, the better off you are. It's very hard to make that shift. So for me at my age, for example, I'm running slower and slower over the years, so I try to focus on other things. I tell myself it's not a big deal that I'm running slower and slower. There's something else. I'm actually quite happy with how it's going. And so all things considered, I don't care. And that's exactly what we need to do, which is to stop fixating on GDP. We can keep measuring it. It's essential as the tax base and so on. We just need to stop equating it with all of humanity's happiness. I'm not sure it's worth measuring happiness in any other way than by asking people, are you happy? I'm quite simple-minded about this. We need proxies. However, what I'm sure of is that we need to be able to propose projects that don't require growth for people to think, hey, yeah, I'm interested in that. So let me use the vacation example. Since you are just on vacation recently, some of you during vacation had material living conditions that were actually less comfortable than those you have during the year. For example, if you went camping, well, you're less well housed than in an apartment. Mosquitoes get in, daylight wakes you up in the morning, you can hear your neighbors passing gas. Anyway, it's objectively worse. Yet plenty of people come back delighted from their camping vacation. So that means there's a way to balance things out, as they say, and there are situations where you can absolutely say to someone, I'm giving you a bit less of this and a bit more of that. And at that point, you need to get them on board. I'm giving you a bit less of that. And then you need to engage people with projects where we've thought ahead about what we can offer with less GDP, but more of other things. So people will accept it, and we frame the pitch, so to speak, around more of other things saying, and I'll also help you adjust to having less of this other stuff. Let me give you an example. If you reduce people's incomes, you must correspondingly reduce rents. How do you reduce rents? You need to deflate the big cities. The first thing we can do is stop concentrating all development in Paris and a few major cities. We need to do the exact opposite from now on. That's the only way. In the countryside, many resources can be virtually free. Start with the air you breathe, whereas people in Tokyo now need oxygen dispensers. So you become able to cope with a drop in your income. I know people who've made this choice deliberately, and I don't think they're any less happy. So it's really about that approach. What I mean is that intermediaries, whether in politics, among business decision makers, or in academia, and so on, need to devise plans that accommodate 1,801, 22, 31,000 employers, 32,000, or you have this large cooling tower. So you have this big cooling tower. These large cooling towers are not the symbol of nuclear power plants. They are the symbol of thermal power plants built along rivers. That's it. Another thing the media associates with them, which is a mistaken association, the correct association is cooling towers equal thermal power plants, not cooling towers equal nuclear power plants. Why is nuclear considered decarbonized? Because there's a ratio of 1 to 1 million between the energy you get from nuclear fission and the energy you get from burning the same mass of coal. So for the same amount of energy extracted from uranium compared to what you extract from a coal mine, there's a huge difference in the amount of material needed. You need much less uranium, so you have a ratio of 1 to 1 million between the energy released per unit of nuclear fuel and the energy released per unit of fossil fuel. As a result, if you use 1 kilogram of uranium, it's equivalent to burning a ton of oil. So nuclear power handles very small quantities of material, even when you factor in building the dam, which required concrete that emits CO2, then hydro-plateaued. As for new renewables, you can see what they represent at the top, and they're not zero carbon either. To make a solar panel, you need 20 different metals, which means you have to smelt them. And smelting metals emit CO2. You need steel metallurgy, silicon metallurgy, copper metallurgy, and so on. All of that emits CO2. So you have varying amounts depending on which energy collector you use. If you use solar panels and store electricity in batteries, you can reach almost 200 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. The range is 50 to 200, and remember, a kilowatt hour of gas emits 400 grams. So you see that renewables are not entirely green. They're less carbon intensive than gas. That's a precise statement. Green isn't precise. Electricity isn't inherently green. If you stick your fingers in a socket, you won't turn green. Electricity is just electricity. You won't transform into a green person. You won't transform into a green person. Sticking your fingers in a socket won't make you green. So what you see about electricity production is that most of it is fossil-based. And most of the increase, even looking at just the last 8 years, is also fossil-based. Meaning before talking about solar panels being installed somewhere, we should keep talking about coal plants being installed elsewhere, because that's what's still happening. Now I'm going to talk to you a bit about the economy and how it relates to the physical system I've been describing. In fact, we don't see this physical system in our daily lives because what you deal with daily isn't kilowatts. You don't go to the vegetable seller and ask, hello, I want carrots. How many kilowatts? You say to the vegetable seller, hello, I want carrots. How much? So that's zero by construction. Do we agree? It's zero by construction. Someone received the so-called Nobel Prize in economics for creating a depreciation function based on that, a depreciation function for something that's zero by convention. That's it. It doesn't deserve a Nobel Prize, but it's exactly, it deserves a joke, not a Nobel Prize. So the Earth is valued at zero for those with basic accounting knowledge. This means that nowhere in price formation do we account for the depletion of natural resources. Nowhere. So the economics you'll be taught here, I'm sorry to be so blunt with my hosts, is based on a framework that can be summarized as follows. You have two production factors, labor and capital. And that's what fills the supermarket shelves. If the shelves aren't full enough, meaning purchasing power isn't high enough, people don't want to work, bankers don't want to invest, and the system will fail. We've been trying this for 10 years in this country, and for 10 years, as my daughter said when she was 2.5, it's not getting any better. If that's not how it works, it's probably because our model of the system is wrong, and indeed, our model of the system is wrong. The correct model is to get the transformed resources on the right, you need raw resources to transform. You need resources to transform, I repeat. You don't create, like Harry Potter, the copper and iron atoms in metal-containing objects. You need to find them in nature. So you need resources and you need the ability to transform them, which we call work. And this work, as I showed you earlier, comes partly from our bodies and partly from 200 external converters that we've created called Superman, Spider-Man, Iron Man, or whatever your favorite Marvel character is. What you see on this graph is a physical representation of the economy. And in this view, capital does exist. It's an internal loop in the system. This building, which is a capital asset, was made exactly like your clothes by transforming natural resources. The only difference is it doesn't wear out when you use it. Normally, this room won't collapse while you're in it. When it does happen, it makes headlines for once, and everyone goes crazy. So capital is just production, meaning already transformed resources that we reallocate because they're durable to improve future production, meaning future transformation of natural resources. That's what capital is in physical terms. Once we understand that, we realize there are other limiting factors in the system. For example, if we have an energy deficit, which you'll see shortly, that isn't necessarily reflected in prices, that's another uncomfortable truth I'll share. There's no price-volume elasticity. We'll see that later. If you have an energy deficit, you'll have a production deficit, even if you have plenty of people ready to work in the morning, and even if bankers are extremely generous, regardless, you have a limiting factor at play. But as Jean-Baptiste said, and his followers said, we don't care about energy. It's a natural resource. It's free. You don't see it coming. It doesn't show up. It's invisible. It's not accounted for. It's off the books. It doesn't appear, it's nowhere to be seen, or it doesn't show up in the metrics we use. So you're saying the debt crisis caused all this? Not at all. You'll see that physics comes first, monetary indicators follow, and if you have resource deficit, you'll also have a production deficit. So who went to Brittany this summer? Quite a few. Who knows where Guilvinec is? Fewer people. Do you know what Guilvinec's main activity is? No idea. Fishing, exactly. Have you ever seen a fishing boat? 2001, 053, 59,060. 0054, Nutu Transcribed, 360. So yes, let me ask you a question. Imagine you have a fishing boat with lots of sailors ready to go to sea and maritime credit ready to finance the boat, but no diesel to put in the boat. Do you think the boat goes fishing? Do people grab oars and move a boat of 5,000 or 10,000? No, not at all. So imagine no energy, no GDP, and behind that, the Douaneurnais cannery processes, nothing at all. And the Franprix store on the corner that sells canned sardines has nothing to sell, so you have no GDP behind it, and the tax administration collects no VAT on any of this. If the Guilvinec trawler has fuel, sailors, and willing maritime credit, but there are no more fish to catch, meaning no resources, well, it doesn't work either, and as Renaud sang, the sea is disgusting because fish mate in it, and the fish appear on their own in the sea because they breed in it, and it's free. It's free. So to generate the fishing GDP and all the downstream processing, you use two resources that are totally free called oil and fish. So there's a little example. And here you can see that today regarding fishing, because you've all heard about it, and legitimately so. The overfishing problem today, we have a resource problem in the ocean that is neither a problem of crew numbers, nor a problem of bankers willing to lend. Those problems don't apply here. It's a different one. It's a physical problem that doesn't exist in our economic conventions. So historically, let me get this to work. Historically, here's how it looks. This is what it looks like. Historically, here is GDP reconstructed since year zero. Reconstructing GDP for year zero is like human population in 10,000 BC. INSEE was less efficient back then than today. But still, we can make rough estimates in terms of magnitude. Here you see what global GDP looks like reconstructed since the birth of Jesus Christ. So what you see is that for a very long time, humanity's economic production barely changed simply because the population barely changed. It varied very little, and there were plagues and other setbacks. And furthermore, productivity per person didn't vary since we had no additional helpers to assist us. We only had our muscle power and a constant number of slaves and a constant number of animals. So it didn't vary. It didn't vary. That solves the election problem. That solves the election problem. You see, that's why I show you this. There's no need to promise growth when there is no growth. There is no growth. But you'll also notice, you who will study subjects related to this, that you also don't have democracy. The only ancient democracies you find are ones that reproduce the slave system we have today with our machines. That is to say, the world we have today with our machines mirrors Rome and ancient Greece, where you had a handful of free citizens sitting on top of an army of slaves. Because while the men were having their orgies and discussing the future of the city, there were millions of slaves around Rome working for them to produce their food. So democracy was not something that concerned the entire population. It concerned a minority of privileged people sitting on top of a majority of the enslaved. That is exactly the system we have reproduced today with machines. We are a minority of a few billion privileged humans on top of a majority of a few trillion machines, except that machines don't complain. Otherwise, morally, there's nothing to object to except for the future consequences. So that's exactly the system we've reproduced. So no growth. Remember what I'm about to say. It's not certain that we'll keep democracy. Democracy, as you can see today, is the art of promising more to everyone. In a world without growth, that's arithmetically impossible. If I promise more to this young man in orange in the middle of the room, by definition, I promise less to that young woman in red over there. It's by construction. In a world without growth, that's how it is. So keeping democracy in a world without growth. Yes, they both exist. I've seen them. In a world without growth, you can't manage the system. Trade-offs will become considerably more violent, so we'd better make them well. Until 1850, before the Industrial Revolution, you can see there was growth, but you need a magnifying glass to see it. The first country where it really took off was England, because England started tapping into its coal, and coal meant machines. And coal meant machines, 10204 qu'on a 17,660, Bleu 204 qu'on a 19,660, that must be resolved in the next 35 years. That is to say, to stay within the 2 degrees of the Paris Agreement, global emissions must reach zero by 2060, zero, not half zero, not a single gram of CO2 released into the atmosphere, no more gasoline cars, no more battery manufacturing incidentally, because that's metallurgy which emits CO2, nothing more, zero. Understood? So we're completely out of the race with fusion, which is another way of saying that the ITER budget is totally useless for the problem I'm talking about. On the other hand, fission, we have it today, it works. And when you look, I don't have time to go into detail today, but I have some readings on my website. There's a page on my site called C'est le moribond, a discussion about some drawbacks or misconceptions about civilian nuclear power. Go check it out. You'll see that the nuclear issue in France is primarily a media problem. Meaning, if the press wanted to talk about what actually causes problems, they should discuss tobacco, alcohol, every day, suicides and domestic accidents, which rank well above road accidents. 20,000 people die each year in their own homes from falls, suffocations, drownings, etc. Meanwhile, as soon as there's a clogged toilet in a nuclear plant, you hear about it in the press. So there's this focus on that topic in France that's not at all representative of its actual drawbacks. I'm among those who think nuclear is a buffer against degrowth. That's how I present it, a buffer against troubles with drawbacks associated with the industry that are minor, actually totally negligible compared to, let me give you just 2 examples. The oldest nuclear waste storage site in the world is 2 billion years old. It formed naturally in a reactor that occurred naturally at Oklo in Gabon. So there's been nuclear waste freely circulating in nature for 2 billion years. Did that prevent you from living? No. Second thing you should know, in France, we produce a few. All the nuclear waste from 40 years of French nuclear plant operation would fit in this auditorium. Meanwhile, we spread in France each year into nature 100,000 tons of pesticides that are just as dangerous in terms of toxicity as the nuclear waste of which we produce a few hundred tons per year that we put in a box. Pesticides, 50 to 100 tons per year dispersed into nature. There you go, 2 examples. I assure you that, well, my conviction, which I took years to form. I've never worked in that industry, and I got interested in climate change long before I got interested in energy, but these are minor drawbacks. So it's another way of saying that developing the industry as fast as possible is one of the buffers for the great leap into the void we're embarking on. That's my view. Nuclear power needs to be developed so we can make something meaningful of it over 50 years because the current technology is unfortunately limited by uranium-235, so it will never be major. It's the next generation, what's called Generation 5, which uses either uranium-238 or thorium. And the ITER budget, we would have been much better off in France, or rather in Europe, putting it into a fast-track program for Generation 5. There you go, which won't prevent 2301, 01, 49, 800, and 1, 5D1, 800. No, not in political speeches. I'm part of an institution called the High Council for Climate. We had a presentation, I can tell you about it since it's not confidential, the document is public. We had a presentation on the National Low Carbon Strategy. The Director General of Energy and Climate A fellow Polytechnique graduate like me actually had the nerve to tell us, well, he didn't have the nerve exactly. It was a ministerial directive, which is one of the tragedies of modern democracy. By the way, this dichotomy between politics and expertise. He had the nerve to tell us that the national low-carbon strategy, meaning carbon neutralities for France, would increase GDP. Let me repeat that. Let me repeat that. Why does he tell me that? He tells me that because he uses an economic model that reverses causality, as I told you earlier. In all economic models, GDP is exogenous. It's an input variable, so it increases because it must, otherwise we have a pension problem. And in all economic models, when you add investments, meaning you install wind turbines everywhere, it mechanically increases your GDP. Models are often Keynesian, meaning you increase investments and your GDP increases, so you start with a GDP that increases anyway because that's the starting assumption. You add investments, it increases even more. And I'm told that neutrality will increase GDP. Obviously, not neutrality that's physically possible means a massive GDP contraction. That doesn't mean it's undesirable. You'll see later the unpleasant surprises that await us with climate change. But I insist it won't happen with growing GDP. It's physically impossible because for 2 or 3 centuries we've done the exact opposite, increasing energy consumption by tapping into stocks that exceed renewable energy capacity. So that's the story I told you. We have underground oil reserves. It's free, plus coal and gas reserves. We also have ore deposits, etc. All of that is free. Using oil means burning it. Burning means oxidizing, and oxidizing is an exothermic chemical reaction that produces CO₂. It's inevitable. You cannot oxidize carbon without producing CO₂, and that won't change in your lifetime. And this allows you to operate machines that transform everything else to make all the products we have at hand. This abundance of products and this tremendous increase in labor productivity, because labor productivity multiplied by 100 doesn't mean each of you became Shiva with 100 pairs of arms and legs, unless I'm mistaken. Since your genetic code is the same as 2 centuries ago, your number of arms and legs is also the same. If I can count to 2, you have 2 arms and 2 legs each. That won't change. So the reason we're more productive isn't that we have 100 pairs of arms and legs, it's that we have machines working for us, except the denominator stayed the same. Instead of putting human plus machine, we kept only human in the denominator. So indeed, the output in the numerator increases thanks to machines and productivity increases. It's just a matter of convention. We could have used another indicator and we wouldn't have seen it increase. So thanks to this tremendous increase in productivity, meaning machines work in our place, it has freed us from many past constraints. First, we could live far from resources, from one sector. I explained that their purchasing power would decline, etc. I thought they'd kick me out. Not at all. It was one of the most engaged and interested audiences I've ever had. So I firmly believe it's a fundamental political mistake to treat people like fools. Hello, why this attachment to civilization? When, besides being a system marked by a culture of control that if it continues to develop can only lead to a dead end where we become slaves to robots, and is also marked by a delusional megalomania called hubris. Why this attachment to civilization when it's a way of life that's completely unnatural since it represents less than 5% of human history, and when we do nothing, we get bored, we experience anxiety and anguish due to the pressures placed on us by civilization, while most people, so-called primitive societies, are perfectly happy sitting for hours doing nothing, because unlike us, they're at peace with themselves and the world. Well, I don't have the answer. Put another way, why are we the way we are? Good question. I wish I had the answer. So why do we do things that in hindsight turn out to be stupid? Because sometimes we make mistakes. We're all like that. I don't know if you've ever made a mistake. I have. So sometimes we make mistakes, and sometimes we make mistakes collectively. Unfortunately, history is full of examples of collective mistakes. Moreover, some situations are hard to reverse. Faust could have chosen not to sell his soul to the devil. He could have settled for falling in love with someone less perfect than Marguerite. I think he'd have been a bit less happy. But in the end, he didn't need to sell his soul. We're in a Faustian bargain here. We've somewhat sold our soul to the devil, meaning we're promised a future that could be quite rough in exchange for living through a brief period that was a short parenthesis in human history. Depending on scientists, humans are 20,000 years old, etc. And we've lived through 2 centuries. It'll last another 10, 20, 30 years. I don't know, but not another century. That's certain of something that resembles a horn of plenty, seemingly without any downsides. We have more of everything with no apparent drawbacks. No drawbacks. How does that happen? So why did we do this? I think one reason is simply biological. Before being thinking animals, we're just animals. So we trust our senses, and our senses are all short-term oriented: touch, hearing, sight, smell, all short-term. That's why, for example, it's hard to explain averages to people. When you talk about average temperature, people don't understand, because the only temperature you can feel through touch is the temperature in this room right now. You can feel average temperature. So we trust our senses, and our senses have structured us to behave in trial and error mode. The whole history of animals, and that's how we learn, is making mistakes, mostly reversible ones. When they're not, we die sometimes. In collective animal learning, there are deaths, including among humans, but we're in trial and error mode. Now we face global problems: 260101, 13, 15,000, 460, lower 1, 13, 15, 17, 460, and not the other way around. The International Energy Agency, completely ignored by the press, totally ignored in December 2018, published a report stating that for conventional oil, meaning shale oil, offshore oil, and Canadian oil sands, everything else peaked in 2008. It has been declining since. Who heard about this besides specialized readers? But I can tell you that this matters far more for your future than most things you hear about in the news, or indeed the vast majority of what the press covers. This means our Iron Man suit is going to start shrinking. That is what it means. Nobody talked about it. So that is basically where we stand on global oil extraction, keeping in mind that oil also includes unconventional sources. What I know from oil producers who have long been saying that peak global oil production, including shale oil and everything, is 2020, give or take 5 years, and give or take 5 million barrels a day. When I say give or take 5 years, that means before you finish your studies, probably and almost certainly before you reach my age. That is absolutely certain. You will see global supply, noting that European supply is already declining, global oil supply contract, and at that point you will face a full-blown debt crisis. It is certain that there is no avoiding it. So this amount of oil extracted is also an excellent indicator of economic activity, because oil means transport, and no economy functions without transport. Here you see 2 curves in red, the variation in the amount of oil extracted. This is not price, it is quantity, and in blue, the variation in GDP per capita. What you see is that since the oil shocks, when we learned to use oil more efficiently, the variation in global oil production is the best predictor of global GDP per capita variation. It works extremely well. It is a good indicator, because what you can see on this graph is that I'm not sure if this pointer works chronologically. You see that the red curve's variation tends to slightly precede the blue curve's variation. So it is not that oil follows demand like growth comes from nowhere. I have more money, so I buy more oil. Rather, oil is a limiting factor in production because you need transport. And if I have more or less oil, I can transport more or less, and I can have more or less transformative, and therefore economic activity. I repeat, our economic system is a transformation system. Economists measure it in euros, but physicists could measure it in kilowatts. It works just as well. So when I joked earlier about paying for carrots in kilowatts, yes, you could pay for carrots in kilowatts. You could pay for carrots with kilowatts. So why should you not focus on price? Because there's no price volume elasticity. Here's an elasticity curve. Look closely. This is elasticity. Yes, it is elasticity. I assure you it is elasticity. Yes, this is elasticity. I assure you it is elasticity. Yes, this is elasticity. What is elasticity? It is a graph with volume on one axis and price on the other. 2701011639 volume 4060, 111641 volume on one side and price on the other, and your teacher tells you if there's more it's cheaper and if there's less it's more expensive. Yes, we agree, that's what you learn. So elasticity is elasticity. Yes, it is elasticity. I assure you, it is elasticity. Yes, this is elasticity. What is elasticity? It is a graph with volume on one axis and price on the other. 207.01, lower 116.41, 4060 volume on one side and price on the other. And your teacher tells you if there's more, it's cheaper, and if there's less, it's more expensive. Yes, we agree. That's what you learned. So elasticity is a curve that looks like the dotted line there. So here I've shown you a century from 1920 to today. The amount of oil available on the market is on the x-axis, and the price of oil per barrel is on the y-axis. Do you see any elasticity? Because anyone who answers yes needs to see an optician. So here's elasticity. Obviously, it's a joke. There's no elasticity, and there isn't one. Not because I say so, but because you look at this curve and there's no elasticity. Long-term price volume elasticity for oil and energy in general doesn't exist. So there's no point looking at prices to know if it will be scarce tomorrow. It doesn't work. And actually, I don't have time to explain the theory today, but you can easily explain why it's structurally impossible not to have elasticity and for prices to rise steadily. The two factors are these. To get a lot of oil, you have to extract difficult oil, so the barrel price goes up. But if you raise the barrel price, you discourage demand. So there's less demand and you extract less oil. So when oil becomes constrained, its price oscillates. It's neither high nor low, it oscillates. So oil constraints won't make prices high or low, but volatile. And that's the only indicator to watch. You see, for a long time it was stable, it was cartelized, but now it's erratic and volatile. An economist looking at this would theorize it completely differently. He'd say there are two inelastic regimes, one regime where volume is independent at a fixed price, then a regime where price is independent at a fixed volume, and then we start again. That's the best approximation you'll find. Two orthogonal inelastic regimes. So in Europe, where are we on energy? Here's the oil available in Europe. The oil supply includes both oil we produce ourselves, the North Sea shown in pink, which peaked in 2000, and imported oil, which hit a historical maximum during the oil shocks, and a secondary maximum at the peak of conventional oil production worldwide, that is in 2006. So the oil entering Europe has dropped 14% since 2006. Who had heard about this? Who thinks there's another reason why CO₂ emissions from European transport have decreased? Is it because we have smart policies? Not at all. Our policies remain completely idiotic. We're selling more and more SUVs, still building highways, adding airport runways. No, our policies remain completely idiotic. We just emit less CO₂ because there's less oil to burn, period. But it creates people who are starting to be deprived of oil. They call themselves the yellow vests, and they're not amused. We weren't prepared. We didn't see this coming simply because we weren't paying attention. Not because it wasn't predictable. We consume gas in Europe. 2801011959 Today, as it did 10 years ago, you still only have one physical square meter, but real estate prices have gone up. Real estate prices increase because you need to borrow more to buy it. Credit production is counted in GDP. If you buy through an agency, the agency commissions go up, and that's counted in GDP. The transfer taxes you pay will double, and that's also in GDP, yet you still end up with just 1 square meter, but you have more GDP. So asset inflation mechanically creates GDP. This doesn't apply to shoe inflation, but it does apply to asset inflation. And finally, we reach the post-peak period. We see two major dips downward. The current upward rebound is lower than all previous ones, and it will head back down before long. At that point, you ask the British, are you happy? They say no. You ask the Italians, are you happy? And they elect populists. You ask, well, it's chaos everywhere for the same reason, because the pie isn't growing anymore. So the trade-offs become painful. For example, if we decide that in Europe we have free movement of people and goods between Eastern Europeans who earn little and Western Europeans who earn much more, well, what happens is this. Industrialists invest in the East and plumbers move to the West. And if you ask the workers, the former Western plumbers, if they find it amusing, they say no. And you know that in referendums, something you learn during your studies, people respond more to the person asking the question than to the question itself. That's the big trap of referendums. You need a very mature civilization